The document hit the table like a gunshot. Lucy Leland did not flinch. She had not flinched once in the 40 minutes since Harlan Drexel's men had escorted her into the conference room at the top of the Drexel Railway building in Redemption, Colorado, and she was not about to start now. She sat perfectly straight in the leather chair they had placed her in, her dark eyes moving across the faces of the three lawyers arranged behind the mahogany table like a row of carrion birds, and then her gaze settled on the man standing at the window. Harlan Drexel was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair swept back from a face that had spent too many decades looking down at people. He had a pocket watch that he kept flipping open and clicking shut, as though every second was a transaction he was monitoring. He had not offered her water. He had not offered her a seat, though she had taken one anyway. And now he had not spoken a word while his lead attorney, a man named Fowler, slid the railroad's claim document across the polished wood toward her hands. "Miss Leland," Fowler said, "you will note that the Drexel Railway Company holds a territorial charter dated June of 1878, granting exclusive access and diversion rights to all tributaries of Soldier Creek within a 3-mile corridor of the proposed Eastern Rail line. That includes the spring-fed branch that runs through your property at Two Forks." He paused, letting the weight of his credentials press down on the room. "Which means the water your cattle have been drinking, the water your crops have been drawing, legally belongs to Harlan Drexel." Lucy looked at the document for exactly 4 seconds. Then she reached into the leather satchel she had carried through the door and she pulled out a cylinder of oilskin, tied at both ends with red ribbon. She set it on the table and began working at the knots with her fingers, unhurried as though she were alone. "What is that?" Fowler asked. "This," Lucy said, "is an original territorial water grant, sealed by Governor Frederick Pitkin and notarized by the Colorado Territorial Land Office on March the 14th, 1876. She unrolled the oilskin and there it was, the document inside yellow at the edges but completely legible, the ink dark and deliberate, and at the bottom the large wax seal pressed with the Colorado Territorial Eagle. She rotated it and slid it toward Fowler with the same quiet confidence with which she had taken her seat. 2 years before your charter, an exclusive, transferable, perpetual right to the spring source and all downstream flow of the north branch of Soldier Creek, granted to Elias Leland and his rightful heirs. I am his rightful heir. That water has been mine since before your client laid a single rail west of Denver." The silence in that room was extraordinary. Harlan Drexel stopped clicking his watch. Lucy sat back and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen 3 hard winters and 2 failed harvests, and one man who had already tried to take everything from her and failed. And she waited. That was when the door opened, and Chester Carson walked into the room, and everything became far more complicated than anyone in it had anticipated. She had not been born to the frontier so much as she had been formed by it, the way river stone is formed, through relentless pressure and the constant passage of something harder than sentiment. Lucy Leland had come into the world in the spring of 1858 in a farmhouse outside of Fort Collins, Colorado, the only child of Elias Leland, a surveyor and water engineer who had worked for the territorial government through the 1860s and 1870s, and a woman named Clara who had died of fever when Lucy was 11 years old. Elias had not remarried. He had instead taught his daughter everything he knew, and Elias Leland knew a great deal. He had trained under an engineer who had trained under the men who mapped the Louisiana Purchase rivers. He understood hydrology, the way water moved through rock and sand and clay, the way a spring could be traced back to its source in the mountains by reading the soil and the vegetation and the angle of the land. He understood water law in the Colorado Territory, the doctrine of prior appropriation, the principle that the first person to put water to beneficial use had the superior right, regardless of where they owned land. He had explained it to Lucy the way other fathers explained arithmetic, repeatedly, patiently, with diagrams drawn in the dirt with a stick. When she was 16, she had ridden with him to survey the north branch of Soldier Creek, a cold, clear tributary that came down from a granite shelf 12 miles east of their Two Forks property and ran straight through their land before joining the main creek half a mile south. Elias had applied for the water grant that year, and in 1876, when Lucy was 18 years old, the governor had signed it. Elias Leland died in the winter of 1879, not violently, not dramatically, but of pneumonia that settled in his chest during a survey trip and would not leave. He was 54 years old. He left Lucy the property, the cattle, the survey instruments, and the water grant, which she had always treated not as a piece of paper, but as a living thing that required tending. By the time Harlan Drexel's agents came through the valley in the spring of 1882, buying up water rights and grazing access and land deeds with the specific goal of controlling every resource the Eastern Rail expansion would need, Lucy Leland was 24 years old, managing a 300-acre ranch by herself with the help of 2 hired hands, and she had already read every single piece of Colorado water legislation that had been passed in the previous 6 years. She had anticipated this moment the way a chess player anticipates a check, not with surprise, but with preparation. What she had not anticipated was Chester Carson. He was 31 years old, and he had come to redemption 6 months before the confrontation in Drexel's office, hired on as the regional land acquisition agent for the Drexel Railway Company. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and a jaw that suggested he had made up his mind about things long ago and had not found sufficient reason to reconsider. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that moved with a precision that Lucy would later think of as the best thing about him, the way those eyes actually saw things, not just looked at them. He had been a cattle driver before the railroad hired him, and before that a deputy in 2 different counties, and before that a young man from Kansas who had survived things he did not discuss in polite company. He was good at his job. He was direct, he was knowledgeable, and he had a way of arriving at a property and making the owner feel that cooperation was not only inevitable but reasonable, without ever making an actual threat. Harlan Drexel paid him well, and Chester Carson used the money to pay off a debt he had accumulated in a dark chapter of his life that he also did not discuss in polite company. He had first met Lucy Leland 3 weeks before the confrontation in the office, and the meeting had not gone well for anyone involved. He had ridden out to Two Forks on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1882, the air carrying that particular mountain clarity that made the sky look impossibly blue, and he had found her on her knees beside the creek bank with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, adjusting the position of a surveying rod she had driven into the stream bed. She was checking the water level against a series of marks she had carved into a post upstream, and she was muttering calculations to herself under her breath. He had stood with his horse for a full 30 seconds before she acknowledged him. "You are standing on the wrong side of that fence," she said, without looking up from her rod. "I rode under the wire," Chester said. "That fence marks the property boundary, not the sky, so what you mean to say is that you crossed it." She looked up then, pushing her hair back from her face with a wrist that left a streak of creek mud across her cheekbone. She studied him with that measuring quality that he would come to know very well. "You are from the railroad." It was not a question, and he had the good sense not to treat it like one. "Chester Carson," he said, touching his hat. "I work for the Drexel Railway Company. I was hoping to speak with you about the North Branch water access." "I know who you work for," Lucy said. She stood, wiping her hands on the thighs of her canvas work trousers. "You have spoken to every landowner in this valley except me. I wondered when you would get around to it." "I came to you last," Chester said, "because your situation is the most complex." "My situation," Lucy said, "is perfectly straightforward. The water grant on this creek predates anything your employer holds." There is nothing to negotiate. Chester had been told before he came that the Leland woman was difficult. Fowler had used that word specifically, difficult, and had said it with the kind of dismissal that Chester had learned over the years was usually applied to people who were correct and therefore inconvenient. He had prepared for opposition. He had not prepared for this, for the specific quality of certainty that came off Lucy Leland like heat from a stone that has spent the day in the sun. It was not aggressive. It was simply absolute. "May I ask what survey instruments you are using?" he said, which was not what he had intended to say. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes. "A Buff and Berger transit level and a set of Lentz rods," she said. "My father taught me his methods." "Why?" "Because the way you have the rod positioned in the stream suggests you are measuring not just current flow but sediment displacement," Chester said, "which is not standard practice." A silence settled between them that was different from the silence of opposition. "Correct," she said, with a slight change in her expression that he could not immediately classify. "I am trying to determine whether the upstream diversion Drexel's men made 2 weeks ago on public land has begun to affect the flow rate on this branch. If I can document the reduction, I have grounds for damages under the prior appropriation doctrine." Chester stood very still. He had not known about the upstream diversion. More than that, he was not certain Harlan Drexel had understood the legal exposure that would create. "Miss Leland," he said. "I will not be selling," she said. "I will not be leasing. If your employer wants access to this water, he is going to have to go through a territorial court, and when he does, I will be there with documentation that will make his charter look like a suggestion." She gathered her instruments with practiced efficiency. "I appreciate that you rode all the way out here. The road gets worse in November if you want to make it back before that." She had walked away from him toward the house, and Chester Carson had stood beside his horse at the edge of the creek and felt something shift inside him that he could not name, and that troubled him considerably for the 3 weeks between that morning and the moment he walked into Drexel's conference room. He had walked into that room because Fowler had summoned him, and because Drexel wanted his land agent present at what he anticipated would be either a quick capitulation or the beginning of legal proceedings that Chester would need to coordinate. He had not expected to see Lucy Leland sitting across from 3 lawyers with an oilskin document laid out before her like a winning hand, but when he saw the seal, he stopped walking. He stood in the doorway and he read the header of the document from where he was standing because his eyesight was good and the letters were large, and he understood in approximately 4 seconds what it meant. "Carson," Drexel said, noticing his stillness. "Come in and close the door." Chester closed the door. He did not come further into the room. He looked at Fowler, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man computing disaster. He looked at Drexel, whose expression had shifted from the certainty of a man arriving at a conclusion to the anger of a man discovering he has been walking toward a wall he had not seen. And then he looked at Lucy Leland, who was watching him with an expression that was not triumph exactly, but something adjacent to it, the composed, watchful attention of a person who has prepared for precisely this moment and is now watching it unfold according to her preparation. "How long have you had this?" Chester asked her. "Since 1876, she said. "That is not what I mean. How long have you known that Drexel would come for the creek?" She tilted her head slightly. "Since 1880, when the first survey teams came through marking the eastern route. My father had already told me what to expect if a railroad ever reached this valley. He told me to keep the grant original, not to file a copy with the county because county records have a way of being misplaced when powerful interests want them misplaced. He told me to keep the original with the governor's seal, because a copy is an argument and an original with that seal is a fact." Chester turned to Harlan Drexel. "Her grant is prior," he said, 2 years prior. "The territorial court is going to find for her on the water rights." "Get out, Carson," Drexel said very quietly. "I am trying to save you a legal proceeding that will be expensive and public and that you will lose." "I said get out." Chester looked at him for a long moment, and then he looked at Lucy, who was carefully rolling her document back into the oilskin. She was so deliberate about it, so unhurried, that it struck him as one of the most quietly powerful things he had ever witnessed. She had walked into a room full of men who held every institutional advantage, and she had placed a piece of paper on the table and turned the entire architecture of the conflict upside down. And now, she was rolling it back up as calmly as if she were putting away a map after a pleasant picnic. "Miss Leland," Chester said. She looked up. "I would recommend that you not leave this building alone," he said. "Not today." Something moved through her expression, brief and controlled. She understood his meaning. "Thank you, Mr. Carson," she said. He left the room, and he waited in the corridor outside the building's front door for 40 minutes until she came through it, and he fell into step beside her without comment, and they walked in silence down the main street of Redemption toward the livery stable where both of their horses were kept. The town of Redemption, Colorado, in the fall of 1882, was a community of approximately 800 people in the middle of a transformation. The railroad was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. The question of whether it would come through the valley or around the valley had been debated for 2 years, and that debate had everything to do with water, because the route through the valley required access to Soldier Creek for the locomotive water stations that every rail line in the mountain territories depended on. Without guaranteed water access, the valley route was not viable, and Harlan Drexel, who had already spent considerable money grading portions of that route, was not a man who tolerated the cost of a pivot. The town itself had a hotel, a general store, 3 saloons, a land office, a telegraph office, a church of uncertain denomination, and a school that had been operating for 3 years under a young teacher from Ohio who had come west on her own initiative. The streets were unpaved and the buildings were mostly frame construction, though the Drexel building at the north end of Main Street was brick, which was Drexel's way of communicating permanence. Lucy walked with her satchel over her shoulder, and her eyes moving across the street with that steady vigilance Chester had already identified as characteristic of her. She was not afraid. He was fairly confident she had not been afraid in quite some time, possibly since girlhood, but she was paying attention, which was its own form of intelligence. "What are you going to do now?" Chester asked. "I am going to ride home," she said. "I am going to check the flow readings I took yesterday. And tomorrow I am going to ride to Denver and file an injunction in territorial court restraining Drexel from any further diversion work on the upstream public land sections while the water rights question is adjudicated. You know how to file an injunction." She glanced at him sideways. "I know how to file several kinds of legal documents. I spent 3 months in Denver 2 years ago studying in the territorial law library. I could not afford an attorney then, and I did not expect to be able to afford one when this moment came, so I prepared to represent myself." Chester stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and then stopped also, turning to look at him. "You cannot represent yourself in territorial court," he said. "Not against Drexel's lawyers." "I disagree," she said. "I have a 1876 sealed grant from the governor. The law is on my side. The documentation is original and unimpeachable. I do not need rhetoric in that courtroom. I need the document and the prior appropriation statute. Fowler will find procedural objections. He will file motions to delay. He will challenge the authenticity of the seal. He will make your life miserable in ways that have nothing to do with whether you are right." She was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, horses and wagons, a woman with a basket, 2 men talking outside the land office, all of the ordinary life of a frontier town going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the war that was being quietly conducted around its water supply. "Why are you telling me this?" Lucy asked. "You work for Drexel." Chester looked at the middle distance for a moment, working through something. "I worked for Drexel," he said. "I'm not sure that is still accurate as of about an hour ago." She studied him with that measuring quality. "He fired you. He told me to get out." "That is the same thing." "Maybe." Chester turned to face her directly. "I have been on the wrong side of a water fight before, Miss Leland. Not this bad, but bad enough. I do not have a great deal of appetite for helping a man like Drexel take something that belongs by law to a person who has done nothing but exactly what she was supposed to do." He paused. "I also think you are going to need help, not because you are incapable, but because Drexel is not going to stop at the courthouse." She was still studying him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that a man who has spent $250,000 grading a rail route does not simply accept a legal defeat and adjust his plans. He looks for other pressure points." Chester watched her face carefully as he said it. "Your hired hands, your cattle, your fences, your well if he cannot get your creek." The implications settled over her like weather coming in off the mountains. He watched her absorb them, and he watched her not break, not even bend. She just processed it and incorporated it the way she had incorporated every other hard thing in her life, quietly, with the self-possession of a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that the world was not going to be any easier than it was, and that the only rational response to that fact was competence. "You are proposing that you help me," she said. "I am telling you what I observe," Chester said carefully. "What you do with that observation is your business. What would you want in return?" He looked at her. "Nothing," he said, and meant it, and she could hear that he meant it, which was the thing that kept her standing there rather than walking away. "I do not know you, Mr. Carson," she said. "No," he agreed. "I have no particular reason to trust you." "No," he agreed again. "And yet you are standing in the street telling me that you have just effectively ended your employment with the most powerful man in this valley because you told him the truth, which is something you could have avoided doing." Chester was quiet. "That is something," Lucy said, almost to herself. Then, more directly, "I am riding out in the morning. If you want to come, I will not stop you." She turned and walked toward the livery stable. He watched her go, and the feeling that had been shifting in him for 3 weeks shifted further, settling into something with more weight and more heat, and he did not try to define it that evening, because he had learned over the years that some things needed time before you looked at them directly. The ride out to Two Forks the following morning took 2 hours on the road and slightly less cross-country, which was the way Lucy went. Chester rode beside her, and they did not talk for most of the first hour, which he found unexpectedly comfortable. The silence with her was not empty. It was occupied by the sound of horses and wind and the specific quality of her attention moving across the landscape, and he found himself doing the same, looking at the terrain the way she seemed to look at it, reading it. "Your father was a surveyor," he said, when they had been riding for about 40 minutes. "A hydrological surveyor," she said, "which is different from a land surveyor, though he could do both. His primary work was water source identification and mapping." "Where did he train?" "He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1850s before coming west. He studied under a man who had worked with John Wesley Powell before Powell's Colorado River Survey." She paused, adjusting her reins. "He believed that water was the single most important resource in the Western Territories, and that the politics around water would determine whether this part of the country became something worth inhabiting or something worth abandoning. He was right. He was always right," she said, with a quietness that held both grief and pride. "How long ago did he die?" 3 years in December." She looked at the mountains ahead of them, the first snow already on the high peaks. "He died knowing the grant was secure. I think that was important to him." Chester thought about his own father for a moment, which was not something he did willingly. His father had died knowing nothing of consequence was secure, but that was a different story. "You have been managing the property alone since then." "I have 2 men who work for wages. Brothers, actually, the Holloway brothers, Frank and Pete. Good workers, reliable. They are at the ranch now. They know what is happening with Drexel. I told them last week that there might be trouble," she said. "I did not tell them how much trouble." "You should tell them," Chester said. "Men who do not know the scope of a threat cannot protect against it." She considered that. "You are right." She looked at him again with that sideways, measuring glance. "What is it that you did before the railroad?" "Several things." "The several things that you do not discuss," she said, and it was not quite a smile, but it was in the vicinity of one. He was surprised into a half-laugh before he could stop it. "I was a deputy in Pueblo County for 2 years. Before that, I drove cattle up from Texas twice. Before that, I worked for a land company in Kansas that turned out to be doing things I was not entirely aware of when I signed on, and when I became aware of it, I left." He paused. "I accumulated a debt in the process of leaving that I have spent 4 years paying down." "What kind of debt?" "The kind that comes from doing the right thing at the wrong time," he said. She accepted that without pressing further, which he appreciated. "And the railroad hired you because of your experience with land acquisition." "My experience with land and with people," he said. "I am reasonably good at reading what someone's real situation is versus what they want you to think their situation is." "And what is my real situation?" Chester thought about it honestly. "Your legal position is genuinely strong," he said. "Stronger than anything Drexel has, and I have read everything Drexel has. Your practical position is more complicated, because the law and what actually happens to people are not always the same thing in a territory where the courts are 3 days away, and the powerful man has people nearby who are not lawyers." "I have known that since I was a child," Lucy said. "I know you have," he said. "That is why you kept the original and not the copy." She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted in a way he could not fully read, something that was not the measuring assessment she had directed at him before but was softer than that, more particular. She turned back to the road before either of them said anything else. 2 Forks was a good piece of land. Chester could see that immediately, the kind of land that repaid attention and work, with the creek running clear along the northern edge of the main pasture, and a stand of cottonwoods along the bank that had been growing for at least 30 years. The house was solidly built, not large but tight, with a covered porch and a root cellar whose door was set at a careful angle that told him the man who built it knew what he was doing. The barn was in good repair. The pasture fences were straight and well-maintained. Frank and Pete Holloway were both in their 30s, broad through the back, with the patient faces of men who had spent their adult lives doing physical work in all weathers. They met Chester with the cautious assessment that was standard between men who did not yet know each other's intentions, and Chester met them the same way, and they found their footing within about 20 minutes, which was faster than usual. Lucy watched the process with the interest of a person who had thought about the engineering of things. She told them about Drexel that evening at the kitchen table, all of it, including Chester's warning about pressure points beyond the courthouse. Frank Holloway, the older of the two, leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pete, the younger, looked at Chester. "You used to work for Drexel," Pete said. "Until yesterday," Chester said, "and now you are sitting at Miss Leland's table." "That is correct." "Why?" Chester looked at the question honestly. "Because she is right and he is wrong, and I have been on the wrong side of that equation before and I did not care for it." Pete Holloway looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them that only brothers can conduct. Frank brought his chair forward and put his elbows on the table. "We have been here 4 years," Frank said. "This is the best work we have had. Miss Leland treats us fair. We are not going anywhere." Lucy said nothing, but her hands, which had been flat on the table, relaxed slightly. That night, after Frank and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, Chester sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and watched the stars come out with the thoroughness that high altitude enables, thick and indiscriminate across the whole sky. The creek made its constant sound in the darkness. Lucy came out through the door and stood at the porch railing with her own cup. "You could sleep in the main room tonight," she said. "The porch settee is not worth much in October." "Thank you," he said. She stood looking at the creek, or rather looking toward it in the darkness where it ran invisible. "What do you know about Drexel's methods?" she asked, "when it comes to resistance?" Chester was quiet for a moment, measuring what to say. "He has used legal delay effectively in 2 other valley acquisitions I am aware of. In one case, a family in the San Luis Valley sold after 6 months of litigation costs. In another case, the litigation did not happen because the landowner's barn burned the night before the scheduled hearing. The silence that followed was full. They could not prove it. Chester said. Or they could prove it and chose not to pursue it, which amounts to the same thing. I see, Lucy said. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I know, she said. You are telling me because you believe I should make decisions based on complete information. She turned to look at him in the dark. That is an unusual quality in a man I have known for approximately 3 days. He met her gaze, which was not easy because there was something in it that he had not expected to encounter, and that required a certain steadiness to withstand. I am a straightforward person, he said. I am beginning to believe that, she said. She went inside, and Chester sat with the cold coffee and the stars and the distant sound of the creek, and thought about what it meant that a woman who had spent years preparing for a legal war, and who had walked into a room full of lawyers with a sealed government document, and won the opening exchange, could also make him feel, in the space of 48 hours, more honestly seen than he had felt in quite a long time. In the morning, they rode to Redemption together, and Chester sent a telegram to a man named Davis Alcott in Denver, a territorial attorney he had encountered during the land company episode in Kansas, a man who had helped him at that time and who owed him a professional courtesy, which Chester was now calling in on Lucy's behalf. He did not tell her about the debt Alcott owed him. He simply told her he had a contact who might be willing to handle the case on deferred payment. Deferred how? She said. Until after you win, Chester said, at which point, depending on whether Drexel can be made to pay costs, the fee may be negligible. She looked at the telegram office floor for a moment. And if we lose? We are not going to lose, Chester said, with a certainty that surprised him as it came out because it was not a professional assessment but a personal one. She looked at him for a long moment. You said we, she said. He had not meant to, but he did not take it back. Davis Alcott arrived in Redemption 6 days later, having taken the faster route by rail to the nearest station and then hired a horse for the remaining miles. He was a compact, clever man of 42 with a wire-rimmed pair of spectacles and a habit of pressing his fingers together when he was thinking, which Lucy found she appreciated because she could tell from his hands when he was thinking hard. He reviewed the water grant document at Lucy's kitchen table with the thoroughness of a man who had learned not to take documents at face value, and after 2 hours he set it down and pressed his fingers together and said nothing for a full minute. The seal is original, he said. There is no question. The signature is Pitkin's, and I have seen enough of his signatures to know. The notarial certification is from the Territorial Land Office, and it cites the specific application number. This is entirely valid. He looked at Lucy over his spectacles. Miss Leland, I have not seen a water grant this clean in 7 years of practice. My father did not do things halfway, Lucy said. Alcott looked at Chester. You said the railroad's charter is dated 1878. June 1878, Chester said. Then their charter is subordinate under prior appropriation. There is no ambiguity. Alcott pressed his fingers together again. Drexel's lawyers know this, which means they are going to do one of two things. They are going to challenge the procedural validity of the 1876 grant on some technical ground, or they are going to shift strategy entirely and approach this as an eminent domain question, arguing that the railroad's public benefit outweighs the private water right. Can they do that? Lucy asked. They can argue it, Alcott said. Eminent domain for water rights is legally murky in Colorado territory. The courts have not settled it entirely. It would be a harder argument than the charter approach, but it is available to them. He paused. There is a third possibility, which is that they pursue neither legal avenue and create practical problems instead. Drexel has done that before, Chester said. Alcott looked at him steadily. I am aware of what Drexel has done before, he said, in a tone that suggested the awareness was personal as well as professional. How do we prevent it? Lucy asked. We make this case public, Alcott said. We make Drexel's position and his methods visible to as many people as possible. A man who operates in darkness is less dangerous when there is light on him. I would recommend a correspondent. He looked at Lucy. "I know a journalist from the Rocky Mountain News who has been investigating Drexel's land acquisition methods for 8 months. His name is Bennett. He has been looking for a clean case, one with clear documentation and a sympathetic figure who can withstand public scrutiny." Alcott looked at her over his spectacles again. "You can withstand public scrutiny, I assume." Lucy met his gaze evenly. "There is nothing in my life that I am ashamed of," she said. Alcott smiled, which seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. "Good," he said. The journalist named Bennett arrived 2 weeks later, and he turned out to be a careful, serious young man from Ohio who asked excellent questions and wrote down the answers precisely. He spent 3 days at Two Forks, interviewing Lucy, examining the document, interviewing Frank and Pete Holloway about the history of the property, and walking the creek bank with Lucy, who explained the hydrology of the North Branch in terms that he transcribed diligently and clearly did not fully understand but recognized as significant. Chester watched her explain the creek to Bennett the journalist, and he felt it again, that shift that had been happening in increments since the morning he found her on her knees in the stream bed. She was using a hand-drawn diagram she had produced from memory, a map of the watershed from the granite source shelf down through the property to the main creek confluence, and she was explaining how the upstream diversion Drexel's men had created on the public land section worked hydraulically, how it redirected flow from the North Branch in a way that would, within 2 seasons, significantly reduce the volume available to her land. The diagram was technically accurate, fluidly drawn, and she explained it without condescension and without oversimplification, as though she assumed Bennett was intelligent enough to follow if she explained it clearly. He did follow, Chester noted. She had that effect. After Bennett left, Chester found her checking the water level readings at the upstream post she had planted on the creek, and he stood on the bank watching her record the measurement in the small notebook she carried always in her left coat pocket. "You mapped the entire watershed from memory," he said. "I have walked every inch of this creek 3 times, she said, writing in the notebook. "Once with my father, once alone after he died, and once this spring when I first saw Drexel's survey teams in the valley. I have been thinking," Chester said, "about the upstream diversion." She looked up. "If we can document the flow reduction with measurements taken at both the diversion point and here, contemporaneously, with the dates recorded, we have a damage claim that runs alongside the water rights claim," he said. "Not just Drexel has inferior rights, but Drexel has actively harmed her under a claim he knew was invalid. That changes the legal character of the case." Lucy was very still for a moment. "That is correct," she said. "That would support a claim for compensatory damages, not just injunctive relief. Alcott should know. He should." She was looking at Chester with an expression that had changed again, moved through another register, and he held himself steady under it. "You know a fair amount about water law," she said. "I have been reading," he said. "Reading what?" "Some of what you left on the kitchen table," he said. "The Coffin v. Left Hand Ditch case and the prior appropriation summaries." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods on the bank, and the creek ran its constant commentary beneath them, and the mountains above were very white in the afternoon light. "Chester," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Yes," he said. "Why are you here?" He looked at her and decided to be as honest as he had ever been with anyone. "Because I do not want to be anywhere else," he said. She absorbed that. She turned back to the notebook and wrote something, and then she closed it and put it in her pocket. She walked past him up the bank toward the house, and when she reached the path she paused and turned slightly, not quite looking at him. "The water is going to need measuring again at dawn," she said. "You will need to be up early." He followed her toward the house, and the feeling in his chest was not uncomfortable. The legal hearing was scheduled for the 17th of November, 1882, in the Territorial District Court in Denver, and the 2 weeks before it were among the most intense of Lucy's life, which was saying something. Alcott had filed the injunction, and it had been granted, temporarily halting Drexel's upstream diversion work, which had enraged Drexel and caused Fowler to file 3 separate counter-motions in the space of 4 days. Alcott handled them with surgical efficiency, and Lucy sat beside him through the procedural skirmishes and understood every step, which Alcott noticed and commented on to Chester privately. "She is extraordinary," Alcott said, on the evening before they were to ride into Denver. They were sitting on the porch, Chester and Alcott, while Lucy was inside reviewing her prepared testimony. "I know," Chester said. Alcott looked at him. "She is also in a vulnerable position. A woman representing a property claim against a man like Drexel without a husband or male family member creates a certain public narrative that Fowler is already trying to exploit." Chester felt a cold, steady anger move through him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning Fowler has already had 2 conversations with men in town, suggesting that Miss Leland's documents are managed for her by a mysterious male associate whose interests in her case may not be purely legal," Alcott said carefully. "He is impugning her reputation," Chester said. "He is trying to reframe the story," Alcott said. "Shift it from woman with superior legal claim to woman being used by an opportunist. It is a familiar strategy. It will not work if we are careful." He pressed his fingers together. "I am telling you because I need you to understand that your position in relation to Miss Leland matters to the case, and I need you to behave in ways that are above reproach." Chester said nothing for a moment. Then, "I have no intention of being anything other than above reproach." "I believe you," Alcott said. "I also notice that the feeling between you is not strictly professional, and feelings have a way of complicating careful intentions." Chester looked at the dark bulk of the mountains against the darker sky. "She knows what she is doing," he said. "She does not need me to manage her. She does not need me for anything practical. She knows the law better than most attorneys I have met. She knows the land better than anyone in this valley, and she has the documentation to back up everything she claims. If I have anything to offer her, it is not expertise." "What is it then?" Alcott asked. Chester thought about it. "Steadiness," he said finally. "Someone who is not going anywhere." Alcott was quiet for a moment. "That is not a small thing," he said. "That is, in fact, the thing most people spend their lives looking for." Inside the house, Lucy put down her testimony notes and sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands, which were calloused from years of work and a little ink-stained from the writing she had done this week, and she thought about Chester Carson. She thought about the moment he had stopped in the doorway of Drexel's conference room and read her document from across the room and understood it, that immediate, precise comprehension. She thought about the way he rode, with the economy of movement of someone who had spent years in the saddle and had stopped thinking about it. She thought about the way he said "we" and did not take it back. She was not a woman who had spent much time on the subject of her own loneliness. The ranch demanded her attention, and the water rights had demanded her preparation, and her father's memory demanded her discipline, and the combination of those demands had filled most of the available space in her days and her thoughts for 3 years. But sitting at the kitchen table the night before the most important day of her legal life, she found the space that had been filled with work and preparation open slightly, just slightly. And through that opening she felt something she did not have a practiced name for, something warm and specific and directed at the man sitting on her porch. She put the testimony notes away and went to the window and looked out at the porch, where Chester and Alcott were talking in the lamplight, and Chester turned his head as if he sensed her, and their eyes met through the glass, and neither of them looked away for a long moment. Then she turned back to the table, and she allowed herself one long, honest breath, and then she went to bed. The Territorial District Court in Denver was housed in a building that attempted grandeur and achieved adequacy, a 2-story brick structure with high windows and a pressed tin ceiling in the courtroom that amplified the sound of breathing. Judge Samuel Hewitt was 60 years old, with a reputation for impartiality that Alcott had researched carefully and found, to his relief, to be deserved. He had presided over 3 major water rights cases in the previous 4 years and had applied prior appropriation doctrine consistently. Fowler had brought 2 additional attorneys with him, which Alcott noted with a quiet adjustment of his spectacles and no other expression. Harlan Drexel himself was not present, which Chester had predicted, because Drexel never put himself in a courtroom where he could not control the outcome. The hearing lasted 2 days. On the first day, Alcott presented the 1876 water grant, walked Judge Hewitt through the chain of title from Elias Leland to Lucy Leland, and presented the contemporaneous flow measurements Lucy had taken at the upstream diversion point and at the Two Forks Creek bank. He called Lucy as his first witness, and she testified for 3 hours with a precision and composure that Chester watched from the gallery with something between admiration and a private, complicated tenderness. Fowler's cross-examination was aggressive and directed specifically at the technical aspects of the measurements, attempting to establish that a woman without formal engineering credentials could not produce reliable hydrological data. Lucy answered every technical question with the depth of a person who had been studying this specific system of water for years, and when Fowler asked whether she had received formal education in engineering or hydrology, she said calmly that she had received her education from a man who had trained with the Army Corps of Engineers and whose work had been cited in 4 Territorial Land Commission reports, and that she had supplemented that education with 6 years of practical daily measurement and documentation, and that she would be happy to walk the judge through every reading in her notebook, all of which were dated, signed, and corroborated by her employed witnesses. Judge Hewitt asked her to do exactly that. She did it for 45 minutes. At the end, Fowler declined to ask further questions on that point. On the second day, Alcott presented the damage claim based on the documented flow reduction, and Fowler attempted the eminent domain argument, and Judge Hewitt asked pointed questions about the legal precedent for applying eminent domain to private water rights held under prior appropriation doctrine, and Fowler's answers were not as strong as he had hoped. The judge took 1 hour of deliberation before he came back. He found for Lucy Leland on every count. The 1876 water grant was confirmed as superior to the Drexel Railway Charter of 1878. The upstream diversion on public land was declared a trespass against a prior right and was ordered permanently removed. Drexel Railway Company was assessed damages of $4,000 for the documented flow reduction during the period of the diversion, to be paid within 30 days, and the court retained jurisdiction for any future interference with the water rights established by the grant. Alcott was already packing his documents by the time the judge finished reading. Chester was standing in the gallery, and when Lucy turned from the plaintiff's table to walk toward the rail, she found him there, and he held the gate open for her, and when she came through it she stopped in front of him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You did that," Chester said. "We did that," she said, and this time it was her who said it and did not take it back. He took her hand briefly, just her hand in both of his for a moment, and she let him, and then she had to go speak with Alcott about the enforcement paperwork, and he stood in the aisle of the courtroom and watched her go with that precise attention that had become his default mode in her presence. Redemption received the news of the court decision with mixed reaction. The population of the town was not uniformly in Drexel's pocket, not by a long way, and there were many families who had watched his acquisition campaign with the quiet alarm of people who recognized that the same machine that was coming for Lucy Leland's water could come for their land, their grazing rights, their livelihoods. Bennett's article in the Rocky Mountain News had run 3 days before the hearing, and it had included Lucy's technical diagram of the watershed, reproduced by the paper's engraver, and her explanation of the upstream diversion's effects. The article had been widely read in the valley. Harlan Drexel paid the $4,000 within the 30-day period. He did not pay it quietly. He paid it through his lawyers, and he made it known, through channels that had no official voice, that he considered the matter unresolved. Chester heard this and took it seriously. He told Lucy, "He is not finished, Chester said. They were at the kitchen table again in November now, the window showing a sky that was gray and carrying the smell of coming snow. The court stopped the upstream diversion, but there are other ways to pressure this creek. He has surveying teams that could begin work on a different approach, one that does not require the North Branch at all if he can find a southern water source. That search is underway. A southern water source would require him to approach the Ute Reservation boundary, Lucy said. I know. The federal treaty makes that approach legally complex. He is aware of that. He will not care. Chester looked at his coffee. The more immediate concern is that there are 3 men in town, staying at the hotel, who have no apparent business in redemption, and who arrived 2 days after the judgment. Drexel has used men like that before. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Frank Holloway was in the barn. Pete was in town getting supplies. The house was just the 2 of them in the gray morning. Chester, she said, yes. I have been thinking about something, and I want to say it directly because I am not good at being indirect. He looked at her. You have been here for 6 weeks, she said. You have no employment. You have been helping me at considerable cost to yourself and with no compensation and no formal arrangement. I am aware of that, he said. I do not know what you want for your future, she said. But I know what I want for mine, which is this land and this water and the work I do here. And I know that the past 6 weeks have been, she paused, looking for the exact word with the care she applied to everything, the best 6 weeks I have had since my father died. She met his eyes. I am saying that clearly so that you understand my position without having to interpret it. Chester sat very still for a moment, and the only sound was the wind beginning to pick up outside, the first edging breath of the coming snow. Then he stood up from the chair and came around the table, and she stood also, because she was not the kind of woman who stayed seated when something important was happening, and when he was directly in front of her, he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the roughness of those hands, and that was, for that reason, extraordinary. I want to stay, he said, if you will have me. I will have you, she said, and he kissed her, and the snow began outside, coming down the mountain toward 2 forks in the ordinary miraculous way of the first snowfall of a Colorado winter. The 3 men from the hotel made their move on a Thursday night in early December, when the snow was several inches deep, and the cold was the kind that cracked wood. Chester had not been sleeping deeply since they appeared in Redemption. He woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. He was out of the house, and in the yard before the fire had established itself in the hay store attached to the south end of the barn, and Frank Holloway was right behind him, having woken at the same moment, and between them and Pete and Lucy, who had come out with a blanket still around her shoulders and immediately dropped it and gone for the water pump. They got the fire contained before it reached the main barn, but the hay store was a total loss. They found evidence in the morning. A kerosene tin left with apparent carelessness 20 yards from the scene, and Lucy stood looking at it in the gray winter light with her hands in her coat pockets and her jaw set. Chester went to town that morning and found the county sheriff, a man named Reeves who had been in the position for 6 years, and who Chester had assessed, carefully, as not in Drexel's pocket. He brought Reeves to 2 forks and showed him the kerosene tin. Reeves examined it and asked questions without any of the deflection that would have indicated a compromised position, and by mid-afternoon he had determined that the 3 men from the hotel had checked out at first light and were gone. I cannot make an arrest without a witness identification, Reeves said, but I can send word to the neighboring county sheriffs with a description. Do that, Chester said. He looked at Reeves directly. And I would appreciate you knowing, Sheriff, that this comes directly after a court judgment against Harlan Drexel. If anything else happens on this property, I want that context on record. Reeves looked at him steadily. It will be on record, he said. After Reeves left, Chester stood in the burned-out hay store with the smell of charred wood around him, and allowed himself the full weight of what he was feeling, which was a cold, focused anger at the kind of power that could not accept defeat and could not achieve its ends honestly, and therefore went after people's barns in the night. He had seen it before. He had worked, briefly and unknowingly, for men like Drexel during the Kansas Land Company period, and the memory of that association was something he carried like a splinter that had never fully worked its way out. He went inside and found Lucy rewriting her flow measurement records into a clean ledger, copying them from the field notebook with the disciplined care of someone who understood that documentation was armor. She did not look up immediately when he came in. She finished the line she was writing, blotted it, and then looked at him. "He is not going to stop," she said. "It was not a question." "Not easily," Chester said, "but there are things we can do. Tell me." "Bennett's article was only the beginning," Chester said. "If we can connect Drexel to the arson attempt, even circumstantially, in print, it changes his calculus. He can buy silence in a valley, but he cannot buy silence from a newspaper that is already watching him." He sat down across from her. "There is also the matter of the other property owners in this valley who are under pressure from him. If they can be organized, if they will speak together rather than separately, the legal and political environment becomes more hostile to his methods." Lucy was listening with her whole attention, the pen still in her hand. "A coalition," she said. "Something like that, formal or informal. But visible." She thought about it. "The Harmon family on the East Ridge, the Becker brothers on the South Pasture, the Riego family who have the tributary north of town." She was mapping the valley in her head as she named them. "All of them have had Drexel's people come to them in the past year. None of them sold, but I do not know how much pressure is still being applied." "It would take someone they trust to bring them together," Chester said. "I know them," she said. "They knew my father." "Then you are the one to do it." She looked at him. "And you?" "I will go to Denver," he said. "I have a contact in the Territorial Land Commission office, separate from Alcott. There are procedures for reporting land acquisition coercion to the territorial government, and if Drexel's methods can be made an official subject of investigation, that is another front he has to manage." He paused. "I also want to look into who those 3 men were. Drexel does not hire locally for things like this. They came from somewhere, and somewhere has records." She set down the pen and looked at him with that clear, measuring gaze that he now knew contained things it had taken weeks to learn to read, the layers of intelligence and the layer beneath it that was something warmer and more particular, directed specifically at him. "You have thought about this carefully," she said. "I have been thinking about it since we got home from Denver," he said. "Drexel does not stop, so we do not stop either. We just have to be better organized than he is, and we have to be willing to fight on more fronts than he expects." Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then, "There is something I want to tell you," she said. He waited. "When I was in Denver studying in the law library," she said, "I read a case from 1879. A family in a similar situation to mine water rights against a mining company whose documentation was impeccable. They won in court, and 6 months later they sold the property for a fraction of its value and left the territory. Because," Chester said. "Because they were alone," she said. "Because winning in court does not mean winning the battle when the other side has unlimited patience and resources and no conscience." She looked at her hands. "I have always known the law was on my side. What I did not know until recently was whether I could hold the position when the battle moved beyond the courthouse." She looked up at him. "I think I can. I think we can. But I want you to know that I am not naive about what we are in." "I know you are not naive," Chester said. "I do not think I have met anyone less naive." She almost smiled. "That is a complicated compliment." "It is meant as a genuine one," he said. They rode out the following week in 2 directions, Lucy to the neighboring ranches and Chester to Denver, with an arrangement to meet back at 2 Forks in 5 days. The separation was practical and unremarkable from the outside, but Chester rode the Denver road with the specific kind of awareness that comes from leaving a place that has become necessary to you, and he found himself, in the quiet miles, having internal conversations with Lucy that he would not have had with anyone else in years, arguing points with her imagined presence, and finding that her imagined presence gave better answers than most real people he had known. The Territorial Land Commission contact was useful. Chester spent 2 days in Denver, making the formal report, filing the arson incident as an addendum to the existing court record, and meeting with a different journalist who covered territorial government and had long suspected Drexel of influencing county commission appointments. He also found, through a contact at the Railroad Commission, the names of the 3 men who had stayed at the Redemption Hotel. They were labor recruiters out of Kansas City, which was a common cover for men who did the kind of work that could not be advertised openly. One of them had a prior arrest record for arson in Missouri. Chester wrote all of this down and carried it back to Redemption. Lucy had, in 5 days, visited 6 families. 5 of them had agreed to meet collectively at the Two Forks Ranch in December. The 6th, an elderly German immigrant named Schaller, whose English was limited, had taken her hand and said something in German that she did not fully understand but that she recognized as gratitude. She told Chester about Schaller when he came back, and he saw in her face the particular softness that she allowed only occasionally, when something had moved her past her natural composure. "He showed me his wife's grave," she said, "on the property. He said in broken English that he would rather die than leave her." She looked at the fire in the hearth. "He is 72 years old." Chester sat beside her on the settee, not the porch settee but the one in the sitting room that had been her father's reading place, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with the unself-conscious ease of a person who has decided that trust is warranted and is acting on that decision. "Schaller will not be alone," Chester said. "Neither will any of them." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about Denver," she said. He told her everything. The coalition meeting at Two Forks in December of 1882 was attended by 11 people representing 5 families. They sat around the kitchen and the sitting room and drank coffee, and Lucy explained the legal framework, the prior appropriation doctrine, the territorial court's jurisdiction, the procedures for filing collective complaints with the Land Commission, in language that was plain and precise, and that gave people who had been feeling isolated and powerless the specific thing that powerless people need most, which is to understand the exact shape of the situation they are in. Frank Holloway attended and said little, but was present in the way of a man who communicates reliability simply by being somewhere. Pete Holloway brought additional chairs from the barn. Davis Alcott attended by prior arrangement, having come from Denver specifically, and he answered legal questions with the practiced patience of a man who liked the application of law to the protection of people who needed it. Chester managed the logistics of the meeting, making sure everyone could be heard, and he watched Lucy at the center of it and thought that he had never in his life seen anything quite like what she was doing, which was not persuading people so much as giving them back their own clarity. By the end of the evening, they had a written agreement to share documentation, to file concurrent complaints with the Land Commission, and to engage Alcott collectively for a retainer that was spread across 5 families at a rate that any individual family could sustain. The Becker brothers, who had money and had been holding it carefully, offered to front Alcott's initial retainer fee as a loan to the collective, repayable without interest. After the families had left and Frank and Pete had cleaned up, Chester and Lucy sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and she looked at the paper where she had been taking notes during the meeting, and then she set down the pencil and looked at him. "Chester," she said, "yes, I want to ask you something directly." "I prefer that," he said. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, not cautiously, not tentatively, but with the clear-eyed honesty that was her essential mode. "I am not asking what you feel. I am asking what you intend. Because I am a practical person and I am making plans, and your presence in those plans affects what they look like." Chester looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them was low and steady, and outside the winter was complete and dark, and the house was warm with the residual warmth of 11 people who had sat in it with hope and coffee, and the specific gravity of people fighting for what was theirs. "I am staying," he said, "permanently, if you will have me permanently." She held his gaze. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said, "though I realize I have not done it the way it is traditionally done." "I prefer this way," she said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said, "that is a yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, the ink-stained, calloused hand that had written water measurements and legal documents and the letter that had brought Alcott from Denver. And he held it, and she turned it over and held his back, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a good long while, not talking, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already present in the room between them. They were married on the 15th of January, 1883, in the church of uncertain denomination on Main Street in Redemption, by a minister who had come out from Fort Collins for the occasion. Davis Alcott attended and stood as Chester's witness. Frank and Pete Holloway were both present, Frank in a jacket that was slightly too small and Pete in a new hat that he kept adjusting. Lucy wore a dress she had ordered from Denver, dark blue wool with white buttons, practical and beautiful in the same measure, and she walked to the front of the church herself without anyone to give her away, because she had given herself away to no one, and was making this choice as she had made every important choice in her life, with full knowledge and full will. Chester stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and felt the full reality of what was happening, which was not that he was acquiring a wife in the 19th century sense, but that he was entering a partnership with a person who was his complete equal in the things that mattered and his superior in several of them, and that this was the best thing that had ever been offered to him. When the minister asked if anyone present had cause why these two should not be joined, there was a moment where the room held its breath, because they were all aware that Harlan Drexel was 3 blocks away in his brick building. No one spoke. The minister continued. They walked out of the church as husband and wife into the January cold, and the assembled well-wishers had bundled against the temperature, and Lucy looked up at Chester in the bright winter light, and he looked down at her, and something passed between them that did not require translation. The aftermath of the coalition's work was gradual and then decisive. The concurrent complaints filed with the Territorial Land Commission created an official investigation into Drexel Railway Company's acquisition methods, and the investigation, aided by the evidence Chester had gathered in Denver about the 3 Kansas City men, resulted in a formal censure of the company in March of 1883. The censure had no criminal teeth but had considerable public ones, and Bennett's continued coverage in the Rocky Mountain News kept the story alive in ways that made Drexel's investors in Chicago and St. Louis uncomfortable. Drexel was not ruined. Men like Drexel are rarely ruined. But his position in the Colorado Territory was materially weakened, and the Eastern Rail route through the valley was quietly shelved in favor of a more expensive southern route that went around the water rights tangle entirely. It cost him more money than the $4,000 damages payment, and he felt it, which was the closest to justice that the situation was ever going to come. Old Schaller, the German immigrant on the northern property, died in April of 1883 in his sleep, peacefully, on the land where he had buried his wife, having sold nothing and yielded nothing. Chester and Lucy attended the small funeral, and Chester helped carry the coffin. The spring of 1883 was extraordinary at Two Forks. The snowmelt was heavy, and the north branch of Soldier Creek ran full and clear through the property, measuring at the highest flow rates Lucy had ever recorded, and she wrote them in the ledger with the particular pleasure of a person who has fought for something and won. The cattle were in good condition. The hay store that had burned was rebuilt, better than the original, with stone foundations that made fire less likely. Frank Holloway had an idea about extending the east pasture fence, and Chester and Pete helped him do it over the course of a week in April. In the evenings, Chester and Lucy sat on the porch in the warmer weather and talked, which was one of the things they were best at together, ranging freely across topics that included water law, cattle management, the political situation in the territory, the books Lucy had read and wanted Chester to read, the places Chester had been that he described to her as though she was seeing them through his eyes, and the specific, intricate, never-boring process of two minds that respected each other working through things together. He had found in her the thing he had not realized he was looking for, a person whose respect had to be earned through the quality of your thinking and your choices, and who gave that respect fully when it was earned, and who required that you bring your best self because she brought hers. It was sometimes demanding and always worth it. She had found in him something she had begun to believe might not exist in the world she actually inhabited, a man who was made more interested in her by her capabilities rather than less, who watched her explain the hydrology of the watershed to Davis Alcott, or to the coalition families with an expression that was not patronizing approval but something genuinely closer to wonder, as though she were a phenomenon of the natural world, like the water she studied, that deserved his full attention. In the late summer of 1883, Lucy told Chester she was expecting a child. She told him at the creek bank, where she had been taking morning measurements, because that was where she happened to be when she decided the moment had arrived to say it. He stood very still when she said it, and then he crossed the distance between them and held her in a way that communicated everything his voice could not immediately organize, and she let herself be held, because she had decided that being held by this specific person was not a compromise of anything but an addition to it. Their son was born in March of 1884 in the bedroom of the Two Forks house, with a midwife from Redemption named Mrs. Calder, who had been delivering babies in this valley for 20 years. He was healthy and loud from the first breath, which Chester took as a good sign. They named him Elias James Carson, Elias for Lucy's father and James for no one in particular, because it sounded right next to Elias and Chester had always liked it. Pete Holloway heard the baby cry from the bunkhouse and came to the kitchen door and asked Frank what to do, and Frank told him to boil water and put it somewhere and stay out of the way, which was the advice typically given to men in this situation, and which Pete followed carefully. Chester held Elias for the first time while Lucy slept, exhausted, in the early hours of a cold March morning, and the baby's weight in his hands was the most specific and concrete thing he had ever felt. And he stood at the window of the bedroom and looked out at the dark creek and the darker mountains, and thought about Elias Leland, the father who had raised a daughter who could read a watershed, write a legal document, and face down a railroad baron with a sealed document and a steady gaze. And he thought that a person could do a great deal worse than to spend a life trying to be worthy of what this particular woman had chosen to build here. Elias was a cheerful child who walked early and talked constantly from the moment he found words, asking questions about everything with a thoroughness that delighted Lucy and occasionally exhausted Chester in the way that thorough questions do when they arrive before breakfast. He loved the creek with an intensity that Lucy recognized as hereditary, sitting beside it when he was barely 2 years old with a focus that recalled his grandfather, and made his mother's chest ache with a sweetness that had no other name. Harlan Drexel's health declined in 1884, the news coming through the telegraph lines and the newspaper in fragments, a collapse in September, a long convalescence, and then the quiet transfer of operational control of the Drexel Railway Company to his son, a man named Gerard who had none of his father's particular obsessions and who was primarily interested in the profitability of the lines already built. The campaign against the Valley families was never formally concluded, but it simply stopped, as campaigns sometimes do when the person who conducted them loses the capacity to sustain them. The Territorial Land Commission investigation had attached a supervisory condition to the company's operating charter that required any further land acquisition in the valley to go through a formal public hearing, which was expensive enough to make it unattractive for acquisitions that were not essential. The Two Forks water grant remained on record, sovereign and sealed, in the oilskin cylinder that Lucy kept in the oak chest her father had built, alongside the flow measurement ledgers and the court judgment, and the letter of congratulation that Davis Alcott had sent after the November decision. Chester took on a part-time position as a deputy for Sheriff Reeves in 1884, 2 days a week, which suited him and Reeves both and gave him a formal role in the community beyond the Two Forks Ranch. It was work he was good at, the reading of situations and people, the specific patience required to diffuse rather than escalate, and Reeves valued him without making a production of it, which was the form of appreciation Chester found most comfortable. The Valley in the mid-1880s was a community finding its shape. The railroad, having gone around rather than through, had less direct presence than Drexel had intended, and the families who had fought the acquisition campaign were, broadly, in better positions than they would have been if they had sold. New settlers continued to arrive, and Lucy became, in a quiet and unintentional way, a person new landowners sought out for her knowledge of water rights and the territorial legal framework, and she advised them without payment and without condescension, in the same clear, precise way she did everything. In the spring of 1886, Lucy told Chester she was expecting their second child. She told him this time at the kitchen table over breakfast, which was more conventional, and he laughed at the contrast with the Creek Bank announcement, which made her smile with a warmth that 4 years of marriage had not reduced but had deepened, the way water deepens a channel it has been running through long enough. Their second child was a daughter, born in November of 1886, and they named her Clara, for Lucy's mother. She was a calmer child than Elia's had been, with gray eyes like her father's and a composed expression that appeared in her infancy and seemed permanent, and which made Chester feel with some regularity that he was being assessed by someone who was reserving judgment. Elias took the existence of his sister with the philosophical acceptance of a 3-year-old who has been prepared for months, and who, on first meeting her, patted her head once and said, "She is small," and then returned to his current project, which was building a dam in the creek with stones, a project that Lucy supervised with a combination of maternal warmth and genuine hydrological interest. Chester came home from his deputy work one evening in the spring of 1887 to find Lucy at the kitchen table with a letter and a new expression, one he did not immediately recognize. He sat down, and she slid the letter across. It was from the Colorado Territorial Land Commission, formally reorganized that year in anticipation of statehood. They were establishing a hydrological survey division to map water sources and document existing rights throughout the territory as part of the statehood preparation process. The letter invited Leland Carson to serve as a consulting surveyor for the division, based on her documented expertise in watershed mapping and water rights documentation. The position was paid. He looked up from the letter. She was watching him. "Well," she said, "it is exactly right," he said. "It is exactly what you should do." "It would require travel," she said, "periods away from the ranch. Some of the survey sites would need overnight travel." "Frank and Pete and I can manage the ranch," Chester said. "You are certain?" He looked at her. "Lucy, it is the territorial government formally asking you to do the work you were born to do. Tell me you are going to say yes." She looked at the letter for a moment, and he saw in her face the movement of something large and long-held, the specific emotion of a person who has spent years building towards something and has arrived at it by a longer road than expected and is taking a moment to acknowledge the arrival. "Yes," she said. "I am going to say yes." "Good," he said. He reached across and covered her hand with his. "You are not concerned about the travel. I will miss you," he said simply. "But concern and missing are different things." She turned her hand under his and held it. "You know," she said, "when I sat in Drexel's conference room with that document, I thought the fight was about the water." "And," he said, "it was about the water," she said. "And it was also about everything else. The land and the work and the knowledge my father gave me and the right to be here on my own terms." She looked at him. You are part of the everything else. Chester looked back at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the two children asleep in the back rooms, and the creek running its constant argument outside, and the mountain standing dark and permanent beyond the window. And he thought that a man who had spent years moving from one incomplete situation to another, and who had stumbled into a conference room at the wrong moment, and seen a sealed document change the balance of power, had ended up, through a combination of luck and honesty and the specific grace of a woman who chose things deliberately, in the most complete version of his life he had ever inhabited. "I know," he said. She squeezed his hand once, and then she let go, and she picked up the letter to write her reply, and he got up to put on more coffee. And outside, the Colorado spring was gathering itself from the snowmelt of the mountains into the creek that ran clear and legitimate and undivided through the land that was hers, always had been hers, and was now theirs. The years that followed were good years, full and various, with the specific texture of a life that has been built by people who know what they are doing and are not afraid of work. Clara developed her father's instinct for reading people and combined it with her mother's precision, producing a quality of social intelligence that made her, by the time she was 6, the most diplomatically effective member of the Carson family. Elias, growing tall with his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, developed a passion for mathematics that surprised everyone and delighted Lucy, who hired a tutor from Denver for his 13th year and watched him absorb calculations with the same intensity he had applied to creek dams at age 3. Lucy's work with the Hydrological Survey Division of the Territorial Land Commission spanned 4 years and resulted in a comprehensive water source map of 12 Colorado valleys that became the foundational document for water rights adjudication in the state after Colorado achieved statehood in 1876. No, Colorado had achieved statehood in 1876. And the new state government formalized the prior appropriation framework that Lucy's father had believed in. The same framework that had protected the Two Forks water grant into the state constitution itself, Article XVI, which addressed water rights with a specificity that reflected everything Elias Leland, the surveyor, had understood about what water meant in the West. Chester read the constitutional provision at the kitchen table the morning the Denver newspaper arrived with the full text, and he read it twice, and then he read the specific clause about prior appropriation and the right of use descending to heirs, and he set down the paper. "Your father wrote this," he said. "In principle. He wrote this when he applied for the grant in 1876. Lucy was pouring coffee. She paused. "He wrote it when he explained it to me with a stick in the dirt when I was 10 years old," she said. "He wrote it every time he told me that water was the most important resource in this territory, and that the people who understood it had to fight for it." Chester looked at her. "He would be proud of you." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." She set down the coffee pot and looked at the window that faced the creek, the same window she had looked through on the night before the Denver hearing, and the same creek ran beyond it, and the same mountain stood behind it, and everything was the same, and everything was different in the way that years of a good life make things different. "Chester," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said, in the plain, direct way she said everything. "I want to say that clearly, not because there is any doubt about it, but because I think important things deserve to be said directly." He got up from the table and came to her, and she turned from the window to face him, and he put his hands on either side of her face the way he had in December of 1882 when the snow was coming, and she put her hands over his. "I love you," he said, clearly. She laughed, which was one of the sounds in the world he was most grateful for, and he kissed her in the morning kitchen with the coffee going and the creek running outside and the children beginning to stir in the back of the house, and the sealed document in the oak chest in the sitting room, and the mountains holding still and permanent over all of it, and everything in its right place and belonging to itself and to them. The water ran on.